I've titled this lecture, The Emergence of Modern Science, and I've given as a subtitle, John Locke's Newtonian Theory of Mind. The focus of the lecture is on the 17th century. The 17th century is very much the dawn of what we are pleased to call the modern age. It's in that century that traditional authority, scriptural authority, the authority of revelation, the authority of customary practices tends to be moved further and further to the side, and the authority of science further and further to the center. The 17th century is not only the century of Newton and Galileo and Francis Bacon and René Descartes, it's also the century in which we find founded the Royal Society, which is going to be devoted to the pursuit of useful knowledge. Its slogan, Nullius et Verba, on the authority of no one, is making quite clear in advance that the ultimate authority, at least within the Royal Society, is going to be the authority of observation, the authority of experience, the authority of experiment. So to the extent that the subject of psychology might be viewed as one of the modern sciences, we can say that it too, along with the other disciplines, is getting its scientific sea legs in the 17th century. Now, I should say right at the outset that this is also a century of transitions. We can find, even in the works of Newton, any number of references to what in the previous lecture I referred to as natural magic, to certain magicians of the 16th century. Newton is saying things that we would also find Paracelsus saying in the previous century. So I say that the transition is not gradual, but it also isn't sudden. Increasingly, it will be data-based, it will be data-driven, it will be observation-based, but I say in every one of these incarnations, 17th century science will show some debts and some residuals of the earlier period. Now, to tell this tale, one has to be selective as to what texts one is going to consult. I think by the widest acclamation we can say that if the age of science in the 17th century had a Bible for itself, it probably would have been what Francis Bacon composed under the title the Novum Organum, the new method, the great instauration. This came out in 1620. The Novum Organum came out in 1620. Earlier in the 17th century, Bacon had written preliminary works leading to this, and the claim is the same in all of them. Namely, science progresses by observation, systematic observation, measurement. Bacon is not hostile to the ancients, but he says, look, if we spend all of our time revering Aristotle, and he deserves our reverence and respect, but if we spend all of our time revering Aristotle, our knowledge will rise no higher than what he attained. And this, of course, is a chap who died in 322 BC. So by the 17th century, Bacon is saying, look, let's get on with it. We can't keep repeating the truisms of ancient Greek science. We've got to go prosecute a scientific agenda of our own. And so Bacon, in this work, makes the case for experimental science and, in fact, establishes the triumph of method over authority. The way you get the right answer is not by consulting the right authority, it's by finding the right method of inquiry. This is a kind of scientific methodism, and it's with us to this very day. It's still the case that an experimental scientist, whether that person has read Francis Bacon's Novum Organum or not, if asked to defend why it is the research takes the form it does, will serve up explanations and justifications that might very well have been torn right out of the pages of Bacon's seminal work. Now, if Bacon's Novum Organum is something of the Bible, then certainly the achievements of Newton and Galileo are the scientific justification for the authority that science is now coming to enjoy. Galileo, of course, is famous not only for the trial that he endured at the hands of the authorities, the church authorities, and for recanting what he had previously recanted and all that. That's a very celebrated case, and sometimes we judge the celebrity of that to be more important than the actual scientific achievements. which were extraordinary. Galileo almost single-handedly was establishing the sciences of statics and mechanics, and in fact was explaining how these sciences are to be developed and defended in the form of dialogues that are still preeminently readable. I might read a brief passage from one of Galileo's major works called The Two New Sciences. This is a dialogue that takes place in what Galileo calls the first day. And he says this: why not say a grain of sand? He's asked by Simplicio, your discussion is really admirable, yet I do not find it easy to believe that a bird shot falls as swiftly as a cannonball. And here's the answer that the character who is Galileo provides. Why not say a grain of sand as rapidly as a grindstone? But Simplicio, I trust you will not follow the example of many others who divert the discussion from its main intent and fasten upon some statement of mine which lacks a hair's breadth of the truth, and under this hair hide the fault of another which is as big as a ship's cable. Aristotle says that, quote, an iron ball of 100 pounds falling from a height of 100 cubits reaches the ground before a 1-pound ball has fallen a single cubit. I say they arrive at the same time. Now, what I want to convey to those listening or watching today's lecture is this strain in Galileo in which he not only shows what the facts are and develops a theory of statics or mechanics to account for it, but constantly contrasts this with the older, ancient authority. He's not out directly to subvert Aristotle in the sense of giving Aristotle a bad name. What he is out to say is that science is not built on authority. It's built on experiment and observation. Aristotle got as far as he got because of the methods he used. If he had better methods, he would have gotten further. The mistakes he made were essentially failures of method. There's something very important in this. Nobody doubts the genius of Aristotle. Therefore, genius isn't enough. If genius were enough, Aristotle would have got it right, because Aristotle probably is as clever a chap as the hominid crowd has ever produced. What Aristotle lacked were the developed methods of science, and indeed the developed instruments of science. The 17th century leaders of thought will constantly affirm the value of method, fixed, repeatable methods, methods of measurement, methods of observation. Now, there are several interesting sort of offshoots of all this. I recall some years ago going through the unpublished letters and papers of the Royal Society, and you see very early in the, after the founding of the Society, which was 1660, very early after that, very soon after that, there will be detachments sent from the Royal Society. The king will ask that fellows of the Royal Society go to a particular place in England to inquire into the claim that a woman has given birth to a sheep. Now, this is not because anyone in the court of Charles II, any educated and instructed person, actually thought women gave birth to sheep. The point I want to make is that 50 years earlier, a claim like that would be checked by the clergy. By 1680, the claim is checked by fellows of the Royal Society. It's a small point, but it's a revealing one, because in this practice you can see the shift of authority from tradition, scripture, the good book, etc., customary practices, to observation, measurement, and the like. The authority of experience. The authority of experience. Now, if Bacon's book is something of a Bible, and Galileo's New Sciences something of a confirmation of what Bacon is agitating for, then I should say the rich philosophical arguments conducing to the same ends are provided by René Descartes, whose dates are 1596 to 1650. Descartes is a very interesting figure. he's been the subject of biography. I think that there are yet other biographies to be written of this fascinating person, this father of analytical geometry, a specialist in optics, a leading philosopher, a geometrician, a logician, a world authority recognized in his day, a mercenary in Europe's endless wars, a fellow who changed residences a dozen times in one year because his celebrity was causing him to be distracted and interrupted in his work, a fellow who, as best we can, did much of his productive thinking flat on his back, not getting out of bed till quite late in the morning, probably hounded by housekeepers who wanted to know what was going on behind those closed doors, and probably incredulous when the reply came back, "I'm thinking," but he certainly was thinking, and quite productively thinking. One of his seminal works is the one entitled Discourse on Method. And in this work, Descartes advocates a position, an official position, of skepticism. That is, the position we should take with respect to knowledge claims is one of doubt. In fact, we should doubt and doubt and doubt until the evidence, the rational argument, the concepts become so transparently clear, that is, of such overwhelmingly persuasive force and power, that to doubt them further is very nearly impossible. Now, to test his own skepticism, he raises the possibility that even in developing a philosophy like this, he is in fact being deceived. That is, it's entirely possible that even as he tries to work through to some sensible and defensible philosophical position, he really is in the thrall of some evil demon who has set out to deceive him at every turn. That is, he might think he's awake when in fact he's dreaming. He might think that he's dreaming when in fact he's living his waking life. He might be inclined to think that something's up when indeed it's down. So what is he to do in the face of what seems to be the omnipresent possibility, either of self-deception or a deception imposed from the outside by, to use his term, an evil or wicked demon? Well now, if I am to be deceived, I must be. That is, the only way I can be deceived is as a thinking thing, as a res cogitans. Only that which has thought is subject to deception. Therefore, from the very fact that I am a thinking thing, I can guarantee at least this much. I exist. Cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. I could not even be deceived of my own existence except insofar as I am a thinking thing subject to deception. It has sometimes been remarked by people taking a rather humorous position on Descartes' famous argument that happily for Descartes and philosophy, he was able to deduce his existence, and in fact, here's a chap who wasn't prepared to accept he existed until he could come up with a good argument for it. I say any number of undergraduate students and other philosophers have had some fun with this Cartesian argument. Some have said, well, yes, I think, therefore I am, but I eat, therefore I am, I sleep, therefore I am, I walk, therefore I am. Descartes' argument, which is not the subject of today's lecture, is actually more subtle than that. What Descartes does put in place, however, is the requirement that a philosophical argument, and philosophy here will include what we now call science, a philosophical argument has to yield clarity. It has to supply a rational being with the very terms and evidence that compel such a rational being to accept the truth of the claim. Again, what is resisted, what is rejected, is the proposition that there is any kind of epistemological authority outside that. Answering questions about what is really true requires that one do something other than read the good book, or consult the local clergy, or ask the king his views on the subject. Ultimately, the truth is served up to those who have prepared themselves to recognize it, and that is ineliminably scientific and philosophical work. The crowning achievement of 17th century science is Newton. A fascinating figure. The more one learns about him, the more one recognizes what a truly strange and wonderful being he is. He died, I think, when he was 87 years old. At 86, when asked what his greatest achievement was, he replied, lifelong celibacy. This is obviously a fellow whose judgments of his own achievements are rather different from the judgments we'd reach. I would not rate his lifelong celibacy high on the list. I think the universal law of gravitation is even better. I think his optics is even better than that, but it could have been that lifelong celibacy for Newton was harder than developing the universal law of gravitation. One of the things that Newton did serve up, however, was a philosophical scientific treatise on how natural philosophy, read science, is to be prosecuted and developed. And the argument in that work, not entirely unlike what one can find earlier in Bacon, and indeed what one can find in Galileo, is an argument for the matching and merging of theory and data, the right kind of experiment as the test of a hypothesis, and whether or not that hypothesis works determines whether or not you carry it any further. Newton said famously, hypothesis non fingo, I frame no hypothesis. What he really meant, of course, is that he did not frame in some reckless way. He did not spin out hypothesis after hypothesis and give each one of them standing merely because they sounded clever or seemed to be in order. At every turn, there has to be some relevant observation that constitutes the right sort of test for the claim that's being made. Galileo, using a telescope in 1609 and finding the moons of Jupiter, obviously has discovered something that the official theory denied. The official theory had set a fixed number on the number of heavenly bodies, and here we find Jupiter with moons going around. In fact, Galileo had trouble getting the authorities to look through the telescope. There's even evidence to suggest that one of them thought he had painted these objects on the receiving end of the glass. This, not to say how dumb and backward were Galileo's contemporaries, rather it's to say they had a different standard of truth. The standard of truth was the weight of authority, very often the weight of ancient authority, particularly when it dovetailed with the doctrinal teachings of the faith. And given that you accept that as the authority, then obviously someone who comes up with evidence that competes with this either doctored the evidence or got it wrong, or the device being used is deceiving us. Now, of course, given the previous lecture, I would remind us that we are the children of the modern scientific worldview. We think that scientific methods tend to settle matters once and for all. There may be some later reckoning according to which our confidence here was exaggerated and perhaps misplaced. So let's always keep in mind that although history inevitably leads up to us, it does not end with us. There will be yet other developments. The story unfolds. Newton's universe is a universe of indefinitely small things. It's a corpuscular universe. At the level of observation, we see things large, but in fact, if we had an ever more granular approach to seeing what things are really composed of, we would find out at the end of the day that no matter how complex a physical system is, it is ultimately reducible to an elementary, atomic, or in Newton's terms, corpuscular form. What gives things their bulk and shape and substance is that these corpuscles are held together. They are held together by attractive forces, by gravitational forces. So the very, very body that I have is made up of indefinitely small particulate entities, but these are held together by the right kind of physical forces, absent which the thing would fall apart. So the Newtonian worldview is very much a corpuscularian worldview, where the form and quality of things is explained in terms of attractive and repulsive forces working on them in such a way as to give them one configuration or another. Do try to hold this in mind, because it is a model that John Locke is going to apply in his foundational writings on psychology, and in fact a model which through John Locke will give modern psychology much of the character it came to have. John Locke was a great admirer of Isaac Newton's. In fact, right at the beginning of the essay, he says, in an age that has hosted the great Newton and Christian Huygens and others, it's sufficient for someone such as myself, meaning John Locke, to work as an underlaborer and to clear a path. His objectives here are going to be quite modest. But ultimately, there is no question that if we use the methods of Newton, if we retain that perspective, if we prosecute the scientific agenda, then a science of the mind can take on the very character of a Newtonian science. And Locke's essay on the understanding is going to try to achieve just that. Now, we have these very complex notions in our minds. If we started to develop a science of the mind today and we found ourselves thinking of science and medicine and disease and politics and presidential addresses and war and peace, we'd say, my goodness, this situation is absolutely hopeless. But Locke now picks up on the corpuscularian theory of Newton and says, look, no matter how complex an idea is, it must finally be reducible to something that is simpler than that. A complex idea must be a congeries or constellation of simpler ideas. And simple ideas must themselves be grounded in what Locke calls elementary sensations. So the theory of mind that Locke begins to defend is this. It's a Newtonian theory. We begin with very elementary sensations like flashes of light, pulses of tone, patches of color, things with shape, things with hardness, things with temperature, etc. From these elementary sensations, constellations of them begin to form. Now, how do elementary sensations get pulled together to form simple ideas? Well, through a form of association, which is working very much the way gravitation works in the Newtonian theory. As Newtonian gravitational forces hold corpuscles together, in Lockean psychology, associational forces hold simple ideas together to form ever more complex ideas, such that when all is said and done, even the most complex notions we have are at least in principle reducible to simpler ideas and then to constellations of sensations and then to elementary sensations. Now, how does Locke arrive at a view like this? Well, he consults his own experience. He consults the contents of his own mind. And the method that he's using, which has been the tried and true method within philosophy for quite some time, is what is referred to as the introspective method. One determines the dynamics of mind by considering one's own mental life. This is going to have quite a long history. It's going to come under challenge later in the 19th century, and of course the debate goes on as to the extent to which a person has some sort of privileged access to his own mental life. But at least with Locke, we have an introspective and philosophical psychology patterned along the lines established by Newton and seeking to become, at a certain point, an experimental science, an experimental and theoretical science of a characteristically Newtonian stripe. One of the issues taken up by John Locke has to do with how much we might know natively. As you might recall from the statements about Plato's Meno, there is a long philosophical tradition, a rationalist and nativist tradition, according to which there are certain things we know innately. They are not the result of experience. They are not the result of a history of sensations and the formation of ideas, but things that we know. I could offer one suggestively right now. We all know that there is no number so large that one cannot be added to it. That is to say that the series of positive integers is infinite. But nobody knows that by experience. You're not counting now and at 7 billion saying, gee, I think I can actually get this to 7 billion and 1, 7 billion and 2. And in fact, if this was something known by experience and just a generalization based on experience, then you would say, well, there's probably no number so large that one cannot be added to it because it's never happened in the past. I've always been able to add one to it. But that's not the way you know that. You know it certainly and indubitably. So the question arises, are there other things that we seem to know beyond the reach of experience, things of a Platonic nature? Locke quite famously opposed the view that there is innate knowledge of that kind, and Locke quite famously is said to have discredited or challenged a theory of innate ideas allegedly advanced by René Descartes. Now, I should say, without going into Descartes' scholarship, that Descartes himself rejected the proposition that he had ever advanced a theory of innate ideas according to which one knows how many teeth a horse has in his mouth, by some kind of innate knowledge. Descartes, however, was wrestling with a problem that is still a serviceable problem. It's still an important metaphysical and to some extent psychological problem. Descartes, attempting to illustrate what might be meant by an innate idea, offers this as an example. Now, this is subtle, and it will require careful listening, and it might even require repeated listening. But let me try to convey this subtle Cartesian point. Suppose it's the case that everything we know as the result of experience. We know as a result of sight, sound, touch, taste, etc. Well, if that were the case, then everything known would have the quality of an experience. That is to say, what we would know would just be these sensations. So the question then would be, how do I know there is light in addition to my having the visual sensation of brightness? How would I know that there is an object on the tip of my tongue that in fact is yielding the experience of chocolate, but is itself something other than that experience? How would I, more generally now and famously in Descartes' challenge, how could I ever arrive at the notion that there is an external material world that in fact is causing the experiences I have, if all my knowledge is nothing more than the experience? How could I ever get out from behind the clouds of experience and recognize that there is really a material world causing them? The answer is I couldn't do that. Therefore, my awareness or recognition or intuition that there is indeed an external world of matter that is the cause of my experiences must be innate. Now, that's the Cartesian sense of something being innate. It must be something, as it were, mentally possessed for us to have an idea like an independent external material world causing something very much unlike an external material world, namely causing sensations, ideas, thoughts, hopes, fears, and the like. Well, here we see in Descartes and in John Locke the famous nature-nurture issue. Certain theories of innate cognitive powers and processes are theories according to which, not unlike Plato's argument, rational beings by their very nature possess certain cognitive powers. Of course, if they're not exercised, they might atrophy, but these are powers which in the course of normal development will find full expression in daily life and are not supplied by experience. On the nurture side of the equation, there can be no such thing. To have any kind of cognitive content at all in our thoughts, it must come as a result of direct and regular experience associated over the course of a lifetime. Well, who's right? In the course of subsequent lectures, we'll have an opportunity to look at data favoring each of those positions and challenging the alternative one. Typically, in matters of this kind, the answer to the question, who's right, is that depends, or in some cases, nature seems to be the best explanation. In other cases, nurture. In most cases, it's a combination of the two. But in the 17th century, a scientific foundation has been laid for systematic inquiries into the nature of mind and mental life. An empiricistic, that is an experience-based philosophy of John Locke's is going to yield one tradition in psychology. A more rationalist and nativistic-based, to some extent somewhat Platonic type of psychology is going to be put in place by Descartes and those influenced most by him. And psychology will emerge later in the 18th century and especially in the 19th century as a discipline following both of these tracks, where they lead, trying to ground the claims of each ever more in experimental observations, direct tests, relevant tests, studies of animals, studies of the mentally ill, studies of the brain diseased, and the like. And the plot will get thicker, the facts will become more numerous, the philosophical possibilities will remain in place, and probably will survive most of the experimental challenges brought to bear on them. Thanks very much.